From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Michael Eric Dyson is the author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. Michael Eric Dyson, you may know from television. He's an ordained minister, has been an ordained minister for 35 years, since you were 7 years old. Is that correct?
Bless you, Doc.
He's also a professor of sociology at Georgetown University and has written for the New York Times and many other publications. Ibram X. Kendi is the author of Stamped from the Beginning, which is the definitive history of racist ideas in America. Dr. Kendi is a professor of history and international relations and the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University here in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much to both of you. Really appreciate it. Before we seek answers, gentlemen, I'd like to frame a question. When you think about the issues that you focus on, what is the question that America faces right now?
Well, so first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming to hear this conversation on race. And of course, I'd like to thank my co-panelists. And it's truly an honor to be here. The irony of this sort of is that it's really been the same question throughout the history of the United States. I think the major question today is the same question that the United States faced in 1776 or in 1787 when the US Constitution was written. And that is, why does racial inequality exist in this country? Why in 1776 were so many black people enslaved and so many white people free? Why is it today are there so many black people in another type of slavery, in prison, and so many more white people are free? Why are black people on the losing and dying end of American society, and whites are on the sort of winning and living end of American society? And we've been debating this question for quite some time, and there's largely been two major answers. The first is that this inequality exists because there's something wrong and inferior about black people. That black people are reckless with the police, and that's why they're being shot in more cases than white people are. That black people are more criminal-like, and that's why 40% of the incarcerated population in this country is black. The other side of the equation is racial discrimination. Racial discrimination causes racial inequality. And then some Americans have argued both, that it is the case that black people are inferior, but it's also the case that racial discrimination exists. And really this three-way debate is the debate that I chronicle in Stamped from the Beginning, seeking to answer this singular question.
I appreciate you raising that, because you look back even the period of the Civil War when people were arguing about slavery. Many of the people, even who argued against slavery, nevertheless did not feel African Americans were equal and didn't want to give them equality. It's a complicated question then, and you're saying it is now. What is the question on your mind, Michael Eric Dyson?
Well, it's to pick up on, and I want to echo Dr. Kendi's...
It'll be a better panel if you say he's wrong about something.
We'll wait and see.
All right.
He ain't said nothing wrong yet. All right. But it's an honor to be here with such a distinguished journalist and a great intellectual. You know, the question is, to what degree is America prepared to go in order to preserve a myth that it knows is a lie? Now, right? That's building on, rhetorically, the intellectual genealogy in both a Nietzschean and Foucaultian sense that Professor Kendi has laid out in brief form, but in powerful form. Because the bottom line is, what you gonna do in the face of obvious mischaracterizations of human beings and your situation? Because you ain't just lying about black folk, you gotta lie to yourself about who you are. In order to maintain black inferiority, you got to exaggerate white superiority. To be redundant, white superiority in terms of exaggeration, right? Now, the only thing I can say is that the present administration is the most irrefutable evidence of the mythology of white superiority. I got to tell you, I probably owe an apology to George Bush. I was like on him, and the soft bigotry of low expectations, that's autobiographical, and dumb presidents and doing stupid stuff. Excuse me, sir. By far, you were not the worst. The guy in office now is. So to me, but Donald Trump is the easy translation for what black folk have been trying to tell white folk and others for so long. Like, white supremacy is narcissistic. It's self-involved. It's self-aggrandizing. It is unconscious of its own privilege and the extension of that privilege as the predicate of a kind of victimizing discourse. It's interesting to me that a lot of, bunches and bunches and, googabs and googobs of white folk who tell black folk, oh, stop victimizing, stop playing the victim. How you explain what's going on now? Then the white working class has been led to believe, and white people in general have been led to believe, right? And not just older white folk, in the millennial generation too. They believe that we talk about race too much, that black folk get too much ink, and they believe that some of the greatest victims of race are white. So when you think about that, how in the hell did we get to that position? The victimization, the victim-mongering, the self-pitying that has collectively been articulated as the basis of American politics is rather astonishing. So the question for me is, to what degree are white people willing to commit themselves collectively to the delusion of white supremacy and understand that until we get rid of that, we won't be able to shatter the real bonds that continue to manacle us, and we won't be ultimately free until we can free each other.
Go ahead, you can applaud if you'd like to. This might be a good moment to mention that Michael Eric Dyson's book takes the form of a sermon. I just mentioned.
I'm going to get that collection at the end. Don't worry about it.
So you raised the present administration. Let me mention a number of ways that people try to discuss the relationship of race to the politics of this moment. People will say President Trump is a racist, or he's not a bigot, but the people around him are, or he's taking advantage of race, or there may be racists among his supporters, or this is all a bunch of bunk and why are you raising this issue so much? The guy is actually just saying things that need to be said. And when you talk to voters, you hear all kinds of things from people, ranging from racial remarks to genuine economic concerns to a lot of confusion. Is the politics of this moment really all about race?
So I think I wrote a book about the history of racist ideas. In order to truly write this book, I had to show the ways in which race was constantly intersecting with other identities or other phenomena. Mm-hmm. And so, in other words, I had to show that really black people, and this book was really a history of anti-black racist ideas, are a collection of racial groups or a collection of racialized groups. And so you don't just have black people, you have black women, you have black men, you have the black poor, you have black elites, you have black professors, right? Mm-hmm. You have many of these different groups, and each of these groups have been targeted by racist ideas. But depending on the group, chances are the idea itself sort of sected with another type of idea. So in other words, the idea that poor people are lazy and the idea that black people are lazy comes together to say that black poor people are lazier than white poor people, right? Does everybody sort of see the way that sort of works? Or the sexist idea that women are weak, and the racist idea that black women are not really women intersects to create this idea of the strong black woman, which is in sort of is in the opposite of the idea of the pinnacle of womanhood, which is the weak white woman, right? And so, I had to sort of show all of these other intersections. And so race is constantly sort of intersecting with class and with gender.
Is that
with
the way you
ethnicity.
see politics now? It's race intersecting with these
Oh,
other
precisely. I mean, I don't think it's just black people who are outraged by the 45th president, right? Black people aren't the same people. I mean, the women are outraged, poor people are outraged, right? Disabled people are outraged, Muslims are outraged. I mean, I'm looking for somebody who's not outraged, right? I mean, so no.
What do you think about people who say that the Trump phenomenon, that what's behind it is economic anxiety or unhappiness with elitism, or you're rolling your eyes practically there? Go on.
Well, I think some of these people are, the easiest way to understand them is sort of post-racial progressives. And what I mean by that is they're progressive in the sense that they recognize that class or even poverty or even economic inequality is a problem, right? But they simultaneously want to reduce everything to economic anxiety, to income inequality. And so that's where the post-racialism sort of comes in, because in their mind, right, race is no longer a problem. All of these issues are issues of class.
Michael Eric Dyson.
Well, the two are not diametrically opposed, are they? You could be anxious economically and a racist. I mean, so to ask is it really relevant to ask a kind of deconstruction of the psychological mendacity that is pervaded by 45? Does it matter whether race is as racist does? I'm not a Freudian or a Neo-Jungian archetypal analytical psychologist or a Carl Rogers indirect approach where I can put him on a couch or, a psychoanalyze him. The thing is, I ain't really interested in the existential anxieties that fuel and feed your demonization. I'm just saying the shit you doing is racist. Right? Like, that's what it is. So, look, Donald Trump is proud of being name-checked in rap music. Look at the jarring juxtapositions that confuse us. A guy who's proud of the fact that rappers have name-checked him, hanging out with...
That's given as evidence that he's not racist.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying he's hanging out with black people, he's got black friends that come to him. What does that have to do with this? This is our problem. We think racism, right? The guy, Justin Volpe, who plunged the plunger up the anus of Abner Louima, was dating a black woman. So you can sleep with a black woman and still be a racist. So you can be name-checked by black folk and still be racist. Even a champagne company was being name-checked by them so much that they said, hey, we don't even want to be name-checked by them anymore. So they had to go from Cristal to Ace of Spades. But that's inside knowledge. Don't worry about it. So my point is that in this culture in which we live, racism is not simply bigotry, right? Which is, Howard Thurman said, a bigot is a person who makes an idol of his or her commitments. Bigotry is real, but racism is also structural. It's also a set of ideas, which is why racist ideas. He didn't say racist people. His book is a genealogical analysis in the finest philosophical and historical form of ideas that motivate people. Even people who ostensibly lay claim to being white liberals may be subject to racist ideas. Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's not the bigot, it's not the KKK that turns me off. I see them, I know who they are. It's the white moderate who tells me to slow down. Who's the problem? So what I'm saying to you is that if you've got a president who stands up and tries to draw a functional equivalence and a moral and ethical parallel between neo-Nazis and fascists and white supremacists and anti-fascists and Black Lives Matter folk, you're dealing with a guy whose corrupted sensibilities are manifest and whose inability to make a distinction between the two reveals the very racist logic that is so evident to us. So we don't want to admit the fact that here's a guy who seems pugnacious and willing to fight but he also reinforces the pathological beliefs about race that have been the basis for what Professor Kendi has talked about in his book and what we know to be the case for interactions with Americans across the board. So at that level, and then finally when white folks say, look, it's just my anxiety. It's just that I'm nervous about the future. So you elect a billionaire as your president? I ain't really sure that you are that anxiety stricken that you get in office a guy who has no understanding of what the everyday person is. Martin Luther King Jr. is in jail in Birmingham, and his white jailers come to him and say, you know what, Dr. King, segregation is right and integration is wrong. He said, no, it's not. And then they start arguing, and he says, how much money do you make? And when they tell him, he said, well, hell, you need to be out here marching with us. So white, this is what I began with. The white working class is now being celebrated as an ideal prism through which to view things. First of all, they can be racist too. In fact, white working class people tend to be a bit more egregious in the external manifestation of race because they're in direct competition with black people over scarcer resources. Economic anxiety is the translation of racial resistance and black animus at the level of the pocketbook. So white folk who say, oh yes, all people should live together, live in suburbs away from Negroes who don't have to deal with housing, who don't have to deal with their kids going to the same school, leave the burden to white working class people to work out the mathematics and algebra of racial conciliation. So yeah, these are the people who don't want black people in unions. They don't want them in pipe fitter unions. They want to dominate the concrete industry. In other words, white working class people have done some of the most vitriolic things against black working class and Latino working class people. So to elevate them automatically as the kind of paragon of virtue is problematic. And then I'll end it by saying this. Then we got,
again,
I'll say this. I'll say this. What trips me out even further, though, is even in the aftermath of the election, Bernie Sanders, my man, joined, right? But look at what Bernie did, though. Bernie joined with other people on the right and on the left who said, hey, identity politics is killing us. So in other words, concerned about queer people, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual people, concerned about black people, about women's issues. Wait a minute.
Is identity politics killing you, by the way?
Yeah, it's called whiteness. The greatest identity, let me tell you what, it's the Kaiser Soze approach. It really is. If you know that movie and you know Usual Suspects, the very thing white folk going around talking about, oh my God, it's identity politics. What in the hell do you think whiteness is? Whiteness is the greatest identity politics perpetrated as a hoax upon American consciousness and history. So yes, I think identity politics are destroying us. And there were no identity politics, notice this, until black people, brown people, people of color, indigenous people began to challenge the unspoken hegemony of whiteness as a universal norm. Look at what Professor Kendi did. So the ideal is this. White people think that they are human. They are not white. We are American, not white. When you people come along saying, oh, why don't you stop being black and be human and be American? That's because whiteness has been co-equivalent with what it means to be human, and white people don't see themselves as white. White folk got to come out the closet and be a race and an ethnicity as well. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. There's a lot to say, and there's a lot more to say. You made a reference there to the Charlottesville situation, the tragedy there around demonstrations and around trying to preserve a statue of Robert E. Lee, which last I saw in the news has been placed under a sheet. Is that right?
So to speak. So to speak.
I'm just leaving it right there.
I think the black folk would rather have it not under sheet.
That's right,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
Well, that raises a question. The president himself raised this question, and other people have been raising this question and talking about other things they want to take down. Statues of the founding fathers, other things. What monuments stay, if it's up to you, gentlemen?
Well, I think for me, let me just say that as an African American, it's very difficult to live by, walk by, even work or go to school in a place named after somebody who, if they were still living, I would be enslaved. In the case of the Confederacy, I think it was crystal clear what they intended if their nation lived. I mean, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, weeks after the Confederacy was founded in 1861, stated that our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. And Jefferson Davis, who of course was the president of the Confederacy, my book, Stand from the Beginning, is named after when he said the inequality between the black and white races was stamped from the beginning, right? And so it's clear and obvious what these Confederate leaders stood for, but we should also remember that these Confederate leaders were inspired by American leaders. Jefferson Davis was named after Thomas Jefferson. His father specifically named him after Thomas Jefferson because he admired Thomas Jefferson. And so there are all of these sort of ideological relationships between the Confederacy and the slaveholding America. And a slaveholding America that dominated America before, of course, the Civil War. And so one of the things that I think about is that people state that you can't really take down the monuments of presidents. Like that's the president. Like, how do you take down a monument for George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or one of these other people? But then when I look at Germany, and I remember that Hitler was the leader of Germany, and I don't see monuments to Hitler, even though he was the leader of that nation, right? And so for me, if it was up to me, I would allow those monuments of people who truly represented what America says itself to be, which is freedom, which is equality, which is meritocracy. Now, you see how I say ideal says itself to be. It's not necessarily that, right? But
it's not that they were perfect, but that they stood for this idea. That's
precisely, and I think slaveholders did not stand for that idea. And I think people who were clearly racist, who instituted discriminatory policies, not just sort of racist, but bigoted, people who divided people, who discriminated against people, who rendered particular groups to be inferior. These are not the people who should be represented and honored by a monument. We have to remember that monuments, or when you're named after something, that's an honor. Like this is we're honoring people.
What about Thomas Jefferson, slave owner? In some ways, the classic kind of liberal progressive who's delaying progress that you described, and yet he wrote the Declaration of Independence and the phrase that got millions of people free: "All men are created equal." What would you do for him?
So for me, again, the concept "all men are created equal" has long been rendered an anti-racist idea, when in fact I sort of demonstrate the way in which that's actually a foundational assimilationist idea, which in my work I classify as a racist idea. And the way that works is you can believe that the racial groups were created equal, but then black people were raised in that pathological culture. Black people were raised in barbaric Africa. Black people were raised in Southeast DC. And so they became inferior. And so now it's my job, either liberals today or Thomas Jefferson then, to civilize and develop people. And so like that idea, the notion of created equal, is actually not by its very nature an assimilation, an anti-racist idea. What actually is an anti-racist idea is if we say groups are equal. You see the difference?
So, great monuments on the Mall: Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. It sounds, I hope Lincoln stays. Does Lincoln stay? Is Lincoln okay?
So I think Lincoln, we can have a little debate.
Oh, all right. How about you?
Well, I mean, I'm getting schooled. I mean, but here's the thing.
You would have said something different 5 minutes ago? Is that what
I'm
you're
going to
saying?
say it now. I'm going to just say it now. I mean, you wanted us to disagree. Now you've got your wish fulfilled. But not ultimately.
Typical media figure.
So here's the deal. I think that what Professor Kendi has broken down there is extremely important, especially in the ideological and philosophical argument about creation versus existence, right? That's what the philosophers would call both an ontological assertion about the being of people and a category mistake, how we how we convince ourselves to lump them under the rubric of a particular description. So that's really sophisticated and nuanced. But when it comes to the monuments, for me to apply that thinking, here's my thought. Right, there is a distinction between Jefferson Davis and Thomas Jefferson for me, right? In the sense that at least one of them was trying to articulate an ideal that could be governing and regulative of the notion of democracy so that his words could be used, even if not with original intent, to subvert his own beliefs and to include Martin Luther King Jr., to include Fannie Lou Hamer, who could use those words as powerful arguments in behalf of the very people who had been excluded. In other words, there was interpretive flexibility. There was what we might call an interpretation that was counter to the dominant one of the original one. But King later on, we hold these truths to be self-evident. When King says that in 63, August 28th, in front of Lincoln, he's doing such imaginative, ingenious reinterpretation of the origins that he makes us think about them in fresh ways. So for that matter, to me, Lincoln, Washington, and Jefferson would be different than Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. You know why? Because first of all, they were not patriots, right? I mean, you're going to have a statue of Huey Newton before you got one of Stonewall Jackson. Because Huey Newton wasn't trying to go nowhere but here. Right? Bobby Seale, Angela Davis should have a statue long before Stonewall Jackson. So my point is, why? Because they were secessionists. They didn't even love your country. They wanted to leave your country. They said it was inferior. It was a wrong argument for the protection of democracy. So how are you celebrating an anti-patriot? That would be like if you had a president who was selling the election to Russia. That stuff could never happen. So for me, I think that frail, flawed human beings, because there's another monument there to Martin Luther King Jr., right? And some have tried to argue, right? Plagiarized his dissertation, right? Used other men's words to substantiate his claim as an intellectual and other things that we don't need to get into up in here. So some have argued, well, the moral depravity of the man contradicts the ethical ideals for which he gave his life. And yet, what I would argue, because in my books on King, I've tried to say anything you're going to say, I'm going to take that, deal with what it means, and still argue that he's the greatest American we've ever seen. Why? Because those flaws do not mitigate the incredible degree to which he poetically, prophetically, and analytically put forth the ideas of American democracy in such a fashion that he made this nation better. I would argue that Lincoln at his best in his reinterpretation, especially reading Kendi's book, and Washington and Jefferson and a few others, as flawed as they were, laid the groundwork for a reinterpretation that subverted their very moral trajectory that gave rise to a movement that contradicted them. I would keep them, and I'm going to tell you why I would get rid of the monuments for the Confederacy as well. People say, well, this is a teachable moment. Ain't nobody teaching nothing. There ain't no teaching going on. I don't see white Southerners taking their children to a Confederate flag or to a monument going, you know, we want to deconstruct white supremacy at its base. And this man was the man. No, because when you have a monument, as Professor Kendi said, you are celebrating an ideal. In a neutral environment, we could teach everything. This is not a neutral environment. And when you celebrate on sacred soil, the public rituals of American democracy, everything that's rooted there must have the ultimate intent of embracing the democratic energy that has made this nation what it is today. That's why I would keep them and get rid of the other cats as well.
I want to ask two more questions if I can. We've just got a few more minutes. I invited people on this social media platform known as Twitter to, I just said I'm going to be talking to these gentlemen, anything you'd like to know. And two questions stick in my mind from people, I don't know who they are actually, but one of them said, would you ask them, you gentlemen, if they feel they have done anything that have worsened racial divisions in America? As public figures, as public speakers, weighing in on controversial topics. Is there anything you think didn't work out the way you would hope it would?
But that's a different question.
Okay.
Well,
It ain't always worked out. But it ain't cause I, no, I'm not presuming that whoever asked that question is one of the many kvetching and complaining white people who say you're a race baiter because you acknowledge race. I'm not gonna presume that. Because let's make it a legitimate question. See, here's the irony. I meet many white people who think because I talk about race, I'm creating race. I ain't created it, I'm revealing it to you. I'm just showing you the chasm, the abyss. I'm showing you the ugliness, and I'm not perfect. Am I flawed? Of course. Have I made statements that ultimately may not serve the interests for which I claim to serve? Absolutely. But here's the problem. Here's the difference. Many white people who are themselves racist will see me and my mistake as the unalterable manifestation of an inherent inferiority and a race baiting that they never see in themselves or other white brothers and sisters, number one. And number two, at the end of the day, what we are here to do, and I don't want to speak for Professor Kendi.
He's about to.
He's going to speak for himself. But I'll say this. As a guy who's been a public intellectual for 30-some years and has been on this front line and writing books and thinking out loud and stuff, I have never claimed to be perfect, but Grace Jones said, I ain't perfect, but I'm perfect for you. So the great philosopher Grace Jones is sufficient for me. And I think ultimately we are trying to do the right thing. We're trying to make things better. We're trying to bring a spotlight to issues, including in our own. I'm trying to squeeze out the sexism in myself as a feminist. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. Do I need to be reprimanded constantly? Yes. Should I re-examine my own principles daily? Yes. But what we must commit ourselves to together is not demonizing each other, but looking at the problems that exist so that we can concretely eradicate the possibility of white supremacy. That's what I'm about every day and all day.
Dr. Kendi.
so I'm actually struggling with this question because I'm actually seeking to answer this question, I guess, for my next book. And I think early in Stand from the Beginning, I talked about the way...
Don't give it all away, though. Let them read it.
All right.
Just tease it. Just tease it a little bit. Don't give them the answer.
I write...
They got to pay $25 for that,
Yes.
doctor. You got to...
Yes. So I'm not going to give you that much.
So you're wrestling with this question, I think.
So I think early in Stand from the Beginning, I state that the only thing wrong with black people is that we think something is wrong with black people. And the only thing extraordinary about white people is that, anybody want to take a guess? They think something is extraordinary about white people. But going back to black people, through studying the history of racist ideas, once I realized the fundamental function of racist ideas, and that function was to prevent people from resisting racial discrimination, from even preventing people from seeing racial discrimination, because they are so infected by racist ideas that when they see inequality, they see what's wrong with black people, right? And so that means those who are discriminating against black people and those who are creating those inequities, those who are benefiting from those discriminatory policies are able to continue to do so because we can't even see, we are not even looking for the racial discrimination, right? Because we think black people are criminal-like. We think black people are poor. We think black people are hypersexual, right? So we're not even going to look for the discrimination in the criminal justice system. And so I asked myself, very simply, are these ideas affecting black people too? Do you have black people blaming black people for racial inequality?
Bill Cosby.
Do you have black people who are refusing to resist racial discrimination because they think that the problem fundamentally is black people? And clearly the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. And so in writing sort of Stand from the Beginning, before I could chronicle and study and reveal anyone else's racist ideas, I first had to chronicle and reveal my own. I first had to come to grips with the fact that I had spent the better part of my life thinking that there was something wrong with black people. And so, to answer your question, yes. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 80s and 90s. Y'all know all of the racist ideas that were swirling, even within black neighborhoods, which people were patting Bill Clinton on the back for passing and pushing through the crime bill and antagonizing Angela Davis, who weeks before was saying he should not do that because that's going to lead to what we now see as a mass incarceration, right? You know, you had black people who were pushing for that because they were so scared of who? Black people, right? And so I realized, you know, that I too, again, had consumed racist ideas. I also realized that really racist ideas had principally, historically, targeted black minds. They didn't want you to run away because they wanted you to believe that you should be enslaved because you were black. They did not want you to think that you should have more resources, that you should have more wealth, that you should not be in poverty, that you should not be in that impoverished neighborhood. They didn't want you, black people, to think that because, right, then if black people did, they would resist. And those black people who recognize that inequality is abnormal, who do not think that white people are superior, these are the very people throughout our history who have resisted, right? And so I realized again that I had not done enough resisting in my life because of the racist ideas I had consumed. So I mentioned a new book. So, you know, I'm actually writing a book that really sort of takes the reader through my own sort of upbringing, consuming racist ideas, and how I ultimately strove to be an anti-racist, right? Because really, I mean, we like to talk a lot about non-racism. Everyone in America likes to stand up and say, I'm not a racist. But really, there's no such thing as non-racism, right? Either we believe in racial hierarchy or we believe in racial equality. Either we look at racial disparities and see what's wrong with people or we see what's wrong with policies, right? There's no in-between in that, right? And so, you know, I'm sort of writing about how I came to realize that there's nothing wrong with people and everything wrong with this nation's policies.
One final question. Also from Twitter. The question was, is there any hope?
Well, I think reading Dyson's sermon to white America, you know, it's, I mean, I should say that philosophically, I believe that change is possible. And what I mean by that is, I feel like an activist, I feel like somebody who desires to bring about change has to believe that change is possible. Like how are you going to bring about change if you don't even believe it's possible? Right? That's the first step. Right? And so I feel like I have all of the evidence as to why we should not be hopeful. I know all the evidence, right? Trust me, I do. And I know it throughout history. Right? I mean, I actually read through some of the most vicious things that have ever been said and done to black people. But at the same time, somehow those black people who were victims of that viciousness still had hope. And I think that's the very reason why they resisted. And I think that's the very reason why I'm sitting here right now talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Dyson.
I'm sure this is true for Professor Kendi. Every day I get threats from white people. They ain't gonna kill me, call me nigger. I got so much nigger discourse, my only hope is, could you call me Professor Nigger? Every now and again, just say Dr. Nigger. They're bold and emboldened. They go on my Facebook page, they send me emails, they threaten me. They say Dylan Roof had the right idea, why does a nigger like me exist? This is from white people. And you can imagine I'm sure, if you haven't had the experience yourself, what that's meant to do. The kind of language it is meant to discourage, the kind of rhetoric it is meant to sidetrack, the kind of ideas that it is meant to implant, and the kind of fear that it is meant to impart. And furthermore, trying to tell other white brothers and sisters who believe it can't be that bad, it can't be that rough, it's not us, when it's your culture that is reproducing the pathogens that lay waste to the moral ecology of this culture. So the same people who think it is a farce not to believe in global warming don't understand that racism in the moral ecology is such a warped and warping experience, and it is system-wide to a degree that many white brothers and sisters may be afraid to acknowledge or fearful because their parents and their cousins and their uncles and their children agree with it. So I think that in light of that, Howard Thurman, who I end my book with nearly, to echo what Professor Kendi said, he said, our slave foreparents faced long rows of cotton in the interminable heat, the rawhide whip of the overseer. And yet what did they do? They envisioned a future beyond where they were. He said, never allow the horizon of your dreams to be reduced to your present experience. That present experience could not hold you. He said, either you're going to be a prisoner of an event or a prisoner of hope. And so I must say that I am a prisoner of hope, that the reason I can talk about the negativity and the darkness and then take it is because my pastor used to tell me, don't fight for victory, fight from victory. And in an anticipatory sense, in a theological sense, we call it eschatology. The end is realized in the present. So for me, I am a prisoner of that hope, and I think that there has to be a way that we can change. I meet so many, after having written this book and I'm in here, I meet so many white brothers and sisters, among many others, who say, I gave this to my uncle, my cousin, I read your book, it challenged me, it was straight no chaser. You tried to show love, but you demanded that we deal with something. I think those people are real. Those people who are willing to give their lives like Sister Heather Heyer, those people like Viola Luizzo, those people who have like James Loeb, those white brothers and sisters who are willing to pay the ultimate price in alliance with and in fraternity and sorority with us, those of us who can come together, we are the manifestation, the evidence of the very thing for which we fight. So yes, I am a prisoner of hope. That's why I'm able to swing against the vicious pathology of white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, and all of the rest of the isms that have distorted the real, true democratic spirit of this nation. And for that, I'm willing to continue to give my life.
Michael Eric Dyson, Ibram X. Kendi. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stand up, stand up.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.